Their apartment was quiet except for the soft breathing of a sleeping child. Robert sat on the edge of his son's bed, watching little Michael curl up under his thin blanket. The boy was only 6 years old, but lately he'd been asking questions that broke Robert's heart. Questions like, "Dad, why don't we eat breakfast anymore?" Or "When can we get pizza again like we used to?" Robert didn't have good answers. Not ones a 6-year-old would understand anyway. The cold air in the apartment made him pull his jacket tighter. He'd turned off the heating 2 weeks ago. Every dollar mattered now, and he'd rather be cold than see his son go hungry. Michael shifted in his sleep, and Robert gently tucked the blanket around him, making sure his small body stayed warm. His stomach growled loudly in the silence. Robert pressed his hand against it, willing it to be quiet. He couldn't remember the last time he had eaten a proper meal. Was it 3 days ago? Maybe 4. The days had started blurring together ever since the factory shut down 4 months back. 4 months. It felt like a lifetime. Everything had fallen apart so quickly. One day he had a steady job, a wife, and a normal life. The next day, the factory announced closures. 2 weeks after that, his wife packed her bags. She couldn't handle the stress, she'd said. Couldn't watch everything fall apart. She'd left without even saying goodbye to Michael. Robert tried not to be angry about it anymore. Anger took energy, and he needed every bit of energy just to get through each day. He stood up slowly, his legs feeling weaker than they should. The dizziness hit him for a moment, but he steadied himself against the doorframe. This was normal now. His body was running on empty, but that was okay. As long as Michael ate, nothing else mattered. Walking to the kitchen, Robert opened the cabinet. 1 can of chicken soup stared back at him. That was it. That was everything they had left. Tomorrow was Saturday, and the food bank would be closed until Monday. He'd been too proud to go there before, but pride was a luxury he couldn't afford anymore. On Monday, he'd swallow what was left of his dignity and stand in line with the others. But tonight, they needed to eat. Robert opened the can and poured it into a small pot. As it heated on the stove, he counted out the chunks of chicken and vegetables. He did the math in his head, dividing it up so Michael would get the most. The boy was growing. He needed the nutrition more. "Dad?" Robert turned to see Michael standing in the doorway, rubbing his eyes. His son's pajamas were getting too small. Robert had noticed that weeks ago but couldn't do anything about it. "Hey, buddy, did I wake you?" Michael shook his head and climbed onto one of the kitchen chairs. "I smelled food." The simple statement crushed something inside Robert's chest. His son could smell a single can of soup from his bedroom because he was so hungry. What kind of father had he become? "Yeah, I'm making us some dinner." "Are you hungry?" "Really hungry, Dad." Robert ladled out the soup into 2 bowls, but he made sure Michael's was nearly overflowing while his own barely covered the bottom. He set them on their small table and sat across from his son. Michael picked up his spoon and started eating immediately, but then he paused. His young eyes looked at his father's bowl, then back at his own. "Dad, how come you have less?" "Oh, I had a big lunch today," Robert lied smoothly. "Had a job interview at this restaurant, and they let me try their food. I'm still pretty full, actually. It was complete fiction. There had been no interview. There had been nothing but another day of searching for work that didn't exist in their small town." But Michael didn't need to know that. "Did you get the job?" Michael asked hopefully. "Not yet, buddy, but I've got a good feeling about next week. I've got 3 more places to check out." Another lie. But sometimes lies were kinder than the truth. Michael seemed satisfied with that answer and went back to his soup. Robert watched him eat, memorizing every detail. The way his son's small hands held the spoon, the concentration on his face as he made sure not to spill, the way he chewed slowly, making it last. When Michael asked for more, Robert's heart soared and broke at the same time. His son was still hungry, but there was nothing left to give. "Tell you what," Robert said, standing up. "Let me check if we have any crackers or something." He made a show of searching through the empty cabinets, even though he knew exactly what was in there. Nothing. Finally, he poured his own bowl back into Michael's. "Found it. I wasn't that hungry anyway." "Here you go." Michael's face lit up. "Thanks, Dad." As his son finished the rest of the soup, Robert sipped water from a glass and pretended it was a full meal. The water was cold and made his empty stomach cramp, but he smiled through it. After dinner, they sat together on the old couch. Robert had sold the television a month ago, so instead they looked at Michael's picture books. The same ones they'd read 100 times, but Michael never seemed to mind. He just liked being close to his father. "Dad?" Michael asked quietly as they looked at a book about space. "Yeah, buddy? Are we poor now?" The question hung in the air between them. Robert wanted to lie again to protect his son from the harsh reality of their situation. But something in Michael's eyes told him the boy already knew the answer. "We're going through a tough time right now," Robert said carefully. "But it's temporary. Things are going to get better. I promise you that." "Okay," Michael said simply, leaning his head against his father's shoulder. "I believe you." That trust, that pure faith in him made Robert's eyes burn with tears he refused to let fall. Michael believed in him completely. He couldn't let his son down. Later, after putting Michael to bed for the second time, Robert lay on the couch in the darkness. Sleep wouldn't come. His mind raced with worries and calculations. The rent was due in 5 days. He had exactly $17 in his pocket. The landlord had been patient, but that patience was wearing thin. He thought about the jobs he'd applied for. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds by now. But this town was small, and when the factory closed, it took most of the economy with it. Everyone was looking for work. Everyone was struggling. Robert's stomach cramped again, a sharp pain that made him curl up on his side. He was so hungry. Not the kind of hunger you feel before lunch, the deep aching hunger that comes from days without food. His body was consuming itself, burning through whatever reserves it had left. But that was fine. He could handle it. As long as Michael ate, he could handle anything. Through the thin walls, he could hear Michael coughing in his sleep. It was probably just the cold apartment. Robert made a mental note to turn the heat on tomorrow, just for a few hours. His son's health was more important than saving money. As he finally started drifting off to sleep, Robert made himself a promise. Tomorrow he would figure something out. He had to. Because this couldn't go on much longer. He just needed to hold on a little longer. Help would come. It had to come. He fell asleep still believing that tomorrow would be better, not knowing that tomorrow would bring the worst day of his life before the miracle arrive. Robert woke up to a sound that made his blood run cold. It was Michael coughing, but not the normal kind of cough. This was deeper, harsher, the kind that shook his small body. He jumped off the couch, ignoring the way his head spun from getting up too fast. His legs felt like they might give out, but he pushed himself forward. Nothing mattered except getting to his son. Michael's room was dark, but even in the shadows, Robert could see something was wrong. His son was curled up in bed, his breathing coming in short, quick gasps. Robert rushed to his side and placed his hand on Michael's forehead. The heat coming from the boy's skin made Robert's heart stop. This wasn't just warm. This was burning hot, the kind of fever that meant real trouble. "Michael, buddy, can you hear me?" The boy's eyes opened slowly, but they looked glassy and unfocused. "Dad?" His voice was barely a whisper. "I don't feel good." "I know, son." "I know, just hold on, okay?" Robert's mind raced. He needed to get Michael to a hospital, but how? The car was gone. Sold 2 months ago when they needed money for food. His phone had been shut off 3 weeks back when he couldn't pay the bill. He couldn't even call for an ambulance. Mrs. Chen next door. She had a phone. He could knock on her door and ask to use it. Robert tried to stand up, but the moment he did, the room started spinning violently. Black spots danced across his vision. He grabbed the edge of Michael's bed, trying to steady himself, but his legs weren't working right. When was the last time he'd eaten? He couldn't remember anymore. No, he couldn't pass out, not now. Michael needed him. He stumbled toward the kitchen, turned on the faucet, and shoved his head under the cold water. The shock of it cleared his mind a little. He drank straight from the tap, gulping down as much as his stomach could hold. The water cramped painfully in his empty belly, but at least it was something. Robert splashed more water on his face and looked at himself in the reflection of the toaster. He looked terrible. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken. He looked like a ghost, but that didn't matter. Only Michael mattered. He filled a glass with water and grabbed a towel, soaking it in cold water. When he got back to Michael's room, he gently wiped his son's face and neck, trying to bring the fever down. "Here, buddy, try to drink some water for me." Michael took a small sip, but immediately started coughing again. The coughing went on for nearly a minute, and Robert held his son close, feeling completely helpless. This was bad. This was really bad. Michael needed medicine, needed a doctor, needed things Robert couldn't give him. "Dad," Michael whispered when the coughing finally stopped. "When did you last eat something?" The question caught Robert off guard. Here was his son, burning up with fever, and he was worried about his father. "Don't worry about me right now, okay? We need to focus on getting you better." "But you look really sick too," Michael said, his young voice full of concern. "You're all shaky." Robert tried to smile, but he could feel how weak it was. "I'm fine. Just a little tired. Let me go get Mrs. Chen so we can call a doctor for you." He stood up, but this time his body completely betrayed him. The dizziness hit harder than before. His vision went black around the edges, then everything started tilting. Robert felt his knees buckle, felt himself falling, but he couldn't stop it. The last thing he heard before hitting the floor was Michael's voice, small and scared, calling out for him. When Robert opened his eyes again, he had no idea how much time had passed. Could have been minutes. Could have been hours. He was lying on the floor next to Michael's bed. His whole body felt heavy, like someone had filled his bones with concrete. He tried to sit up, but even that seemed impossible. Every movement took enormous effort. His arms shook. His head pounded. But worse than any of that was the fear. The crushing, overwhelming fear that he'd failed his son. "Dad? Dad, please wake up." Michael's voice sounded far away, even though Robert knew his son was right next to him. He managed to turn his head and saw Michael leaning over the edge of the bed, tears running down his feverish face. "I'm here, buddy," Robert managed to say. His voice came out as barely a croak. "I'm okay. You fell down. You've been sleeping on the floor. Just got a little dizzy. I'm fine now," but he wasn't fine. Robert knew that. His body was shutting down. Days without food had caught up with him, and now when Michael needed him most, he couldn't even stand up. Michael climbed down from the bed, moving slowly because of his fever. The boy dragged his blanket off the mattress and carefully laid it over his father. "There," Michael said softly, "so you don't get cold." The gesture, so simple and so full of love, broke something inside Robert. Tears started running down his face. His 6-year-old son, sick with fever, was taking care of him because he couldn't take care of himself. "You're a good boy, Michael. The best boy in the whole world." Michael lay down next to him on the floor, curling up against his father's side. "It's okay, Dad. We'll be okay. We have each other." They lay there together in the cold apartment as the first light of dawn started creeping through the window. Robert kept his arm around his son, feeling the heat radiating from the boy's small body. He prayed silently, something he hadn't done in years. "Please," he thought, "please let someone help us. I don't care what happens to me, but please help my son." Time passed strangely. Robert drifted in and out of consciousness. Sometimes he was aware of Michael next to him. Sometimes everything went dark. His body was giving up, surrendering to the hunger and exhaustion that had built up over weeks. At some point he heard knocking. Distant at first, then louder, then voices. Mrs. Chen's voice calling their names. The sound of a key turning in the lock. Robert tried to respond, tried to call out, but his voice wouldn't work anymore. The apartment door opened. Footsteps rushed toward them. Mrs. Chen's gasped when she found them on the floor. "Oh my God, Robert? Michael?" More sounds. Mrs. Chen on the phone, her voice urgent and scared. "Yes, an ambulance. Please hurry. There's a man and a little boy. They're both unconscious. Please hurry." Robert felt hands checking his pulse, heard Mrs. Chen talking to Michael, trying to keep the boy awake. He wanted to thank her, wanted to tell her how grateful he was, but the darkness was pulling him under again. Sirens in the distance, getting closer, the sound of heavy boots on stairs, paramedics rushing into the apartment, their professional voices cutting through the fog in Robert's brain. "Severe malnutrition," one of them said. "Dehydration. Blood pressure is dangerously low. We need to get him stabilized." "The boy's got a high fever," another voice added. "Possible pneumonia. They were lifting him onto a stretcher." Robert fought to stay conscious, fought to see where Michael was. He caught a glimpse of his son on another stretcher, an oxygen mask on his small face. "Michael," Robert tried to say, but it came out as barely a whisper. "Your son's going to be okay," a paramedic told him gently. "We're taking you both to the hospital. Just try to relax." As they carried him out of the apartment, Robert saw something strange. There were other people in the hallway. People in suits. Black cars outside. What was happening? But before he could make sense of any of it, the exhaustion won. Robert's eyes closed and he sank into darkness, not knowing that everything was about to change. Not knowing that while he'd been fighting to survive, people had been searching for him desperately. not knowing that help hadn't just arrived. A miracle had arrived. The first thing Robert noticed when he started waking up was the smell. Clean sheets, antiseptic, medicine, hospital smells. Then he felt the softness beneath him, so different from the hard floor where he'd collapsed. Slowly, carefully, he opened his eyes. The room was bright with morning sunlight. For a moment, panic seized him. Hospital meant bills. Bills meant debt they couldn't afford. They were already drowning, and now this would push them under completely. But then he turned his head and saw Michael in the bed right next to his. His son was sleeping peacefully, his chest rising and falling in steady, healthy breaths. The fever flush was gone from his cheeks. He looked better. So much better. Robert's eyes filled with tears of relief. Michael was okay. Nothing else mattered, Mr. Bennett. Robert turned to see a man sitting in a chair between the two beds. He was older, maybe in his 60s, with silver hair and a kind face. He wore an expensive suit, the kind Robert had only seen on television. In his hands he held a leather folder. "Who are you?" Robert's voice came out scratchy and weak. The man stood and approached slowly like he didn't want to startle him. "My name is William Grant. I'm an attorney. I've been looking for you for a very long time." "An attorney?" Fear crept into Robert's chest. "Did I do something wrong? Is this about unpaid bills?" No, nothing like that." William pulled his chair closer and sat down again. "Mr. Bennett, I have some very important things to tell you. But first, how are you feeling? The doctor said you were severely malnourished." Robert looked away, ashamed. "I'm fine. Is Michael really okay? He had a terrible fever. Your son is going to be just fine. The doctors treated his infection, and he's responding well to the medication. He should wake up soon." William paused. "The nurses told me something, though. They said you hadn't eaten in days, maybe longer. I did what I had to do. You were starving yourself so your son could eat. It wasn't a question." But Robert nodded anyway. He's 6 years old. He needs food more than I do. That's just what fathers do. William's eyes softened. "You're a good man, Mr. Bennett. Which is why what I'm about to tell you is going to feel even more unfair." Robert's stomach knotted with anxiety. "What do you mean?" The attorney opened his leather folder and pulled out several documents. "Do you remember your uncle? Your father's brother, Theodore Bennett?" Robert frowned, searching his memory. "Uncle Ted? I haven't seen him since I was a kid. Maybe since I was 8 or 9? He came to my dad's funeral, but after that we lost touch. Why?" "Theodore passed away about 18 months ago." "Oh." Robert felt a pang of sadness for a man he barely remembered. "I'm sorry to hear that. Before he died, your uncle had become quite successful. He worked in technology, held several important patents. He never married, never had children. You were his only living relative." Something in William's tone made Robert's heart beat faster. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that Theodore left everything to you. His entire estate. We've been trying to find you for over 6 months, but you'd moved after the factory closed. Your old address didn't forward mail. Your phone was disconnected. We hired investigators, searched databases, but you'd somehow fallen through the cracks." William's voice grew heavy with emotion. "If we'd found you just a few weeks earlier, you wouldn't have had to go through any of this." Robert stared at him, not comprehending. "Left me what, exactly?" William handed him a document. Robert's hands shook as he tried to read it, but the numbers didn't make sense. There were too many zeros. It had to be a mistake. "That can't be right," Robert whispered. "After taxes, legal fees, and estate expenses, your inheritance comes to approximately $43 million. The room tilted. Robert thought he might pass out again. "That's not possible. You've made a mistake. You've got the wrong person." "There's no mistake. We've verified everything multiple times. Your uncle was brilliant, Mr. Bennett. His patents alone generated enormous wealth, and he left all of it to you." Robert looked at the papers in his hands, then at Michael sleeping peacefully nearby, then back at William. "Are you telling me that while I was selling everything I owned, while I was starving, while my son was getting sick because we had no heat, all this money was just sitting there waiting for me?" "I'm afraid so, and I cannot tell you how sorry I am about that. We tried everything to find you, but somehow during the hardest months of your life you became invisible to our search efforts." A sound escaped Robert's throat, something between a laugh and a sob. It was too much, too absurd, too cruel and too wonderful at the same time. He'd been ready to give up. Just last night, lying on that cold floor, he'd thought it was over. Thought he'd failed his son, and all along salvation had been looking for him. "This is real?" Robert asked, his voice breaking. "This is really real. It's absolutely real. The money has been sitting in a trust account waiting for you. As soon as you're well enough to sign the papers, it's all yours." Robert covered his face with his hands. His whole body shook as the emotions finally broke through. Relief, gratitude, grief for all they'd suffered unnecessarily. Joy that it was over, fear that it might still be a dream. William sat quietly, letting him process everything. After a few minutes, Robert wiped his eyes and looked at the attorney again. "Why did he do this? Uncle Ted barely knew me." "I asked him that once, actually," William said. "This was a few years before he passed. He told me that he'd made many mistakes in his life, but the biggest one was losing touch with family. He said that after your father died, he should have stepped up, should have been there for you. But he got lost in his work, and by the time he realized what he'd missed, too many years had passed. He felt it was too late to rebuild that relationship." "It wouldn't have been too late," Robert said softly. "I think he knew that deep down, but he was proud and stubborn. So instead, he decided to make sure you'd be taken care of after he was gone. It was his way of saying sorry, I suppose." Robert looked at Michael again. His son stirred slightly, then settled back into sleep. Everything had changed in the span of a single conversation. Yesterday they had nothing. Today they had everything. "What do I do now?" Robert asked. "First, you get healthy. The doctors want to monitor you for a few more days. Make sure your body recovers properly from the malnutrition. Meanwhile, I'll start the paperwork. We'll need your signature on several documents, but there's no rush. Take the time you need. And then?" William smiled. "Then you decide what kind of life you want to build, for yourself and your son." A nurse came in to check on Robert's vitals and adjust his IV. She smiled warmly at him. "You're looking much better. We've been feeding you through the IV, and your levels are starting to improve. Another day or two and we'll have you eating solid foods again." After she left, Robert turned back to William. "The hospital bills. I can't possibly afford." "Already taken care of," William interrupted gently. "Consider it an advance on your inheritance. You don't need to worry about money ever again, Mr. Bennett." Those words felt foreign, impossible. For months, every single thought had been about money. How to get it. How to stretch it. What to sell next. And now this stranger was telling him those worries were over forever. "Dad?" Both men turned. Michael was awake, his brown eyes clear and alert. He looked at his father, then at the stranger, then back at his father with confusion. Robert reached out his hand, and Michael carefully climbed out of his bed and came over. Robert pulled his son close, holding him tight. "How are you feeling, buddy?" "Better. My head doesn't hurt anymore." Michael looked around the nice hospital room. "Dad, how are we paying for this? I heard the doctor say we'd be here for days." Robert looked at William, who nodded encouragingly. "Michael, something pretty amazing has happened. You remember Uncle Ted, my uncle that I told you about? The one you haven't seen in a long time?" "Yeah, well, it turns out he left us some money. A lot of money. We're going to be okay now. More than okay." Michael's eyes widened. "Really? We can buy food again?" The simple question broke Robert's heart. His son's biggest wish was just to have enough food. "We can buy whatever we want," Robert said, his voice thick with emotion. "Those hard days are over. I promise you." Michael hugged his father tighter. "I'm glad, Dad. I was really scared." "I know, son. I was scared too. But we made it through. We made it through together." As father and son held each other in that hospital room, William quietly gathered his papers and stood to leave, giving them privacy. At the door, he paused and looked back at them. He'd been a lawyer for 40 years, had delivered news of inheritances to dozens of people. But he'd never seen anyone who needed it more than this father and son. Sometimes he thought miracles do happen. They just happen when you least expect them. 3 days passed in the hospital, and they were the strangest 3 days of Robert's life. Nurses brought him meals on trays, and for the first time in months, he didn't have to count every bite or worry about saving food for later. He could actually eat. The doctors had started him on small portions because his body needed time to adjust. But even those small meals felt like feasts. Michael was released on the second day, but he refused to leave without his father. The hospital staff, understanding the situation, set up a cot in Robert's room so Michael could stay. The boy spent his time coloring with crayons the nurses brought him, or reading books from the hospital's children's library, or just sitting next to his dad's bed talking about everything and nothing. On the third morning, a doctor came in with a smile. "Well, Mr. Bennett, your blood work looks much better. You're not completely recovered yet, but you're stable enough to go home. We'll send you with some nutritional supplements and a meal plan to help you rebuild your strength safely." Home. The word felt strange. The cold apartment with empty cabinets wasn't really a home anymore. But Robert nodded. "Thank you, doctor, for everything." After the doctor left, William returned with a briefcase full of papers. He'd visited every day, patiently explaining financial details that made Robert's head spin. Trusts and accounts and investments in things Robert had never had to think about before. "Before you leave the hospital," William said, spreading documents across the rolling table, "we need to make some decisions. First, about your living situation." "The apartment," Robert said. "I owe 2 months' rent. I should pay that before." "Already handled. I contacted your landlord, paid what you owed, plus 3 months advance. But Robert, you don't have to stay there. You can afford to live anywhere now." The thought was overwhelming. "I wouldn't even know where to start looking." "That's what I'm here for. I've taken the liberty of researching some options." William pulled out photos of houses. "These are all in good school districts, close to medical facilities, reasonably priced. Nothing too extravagant, but comfortable and safe." Robert looked through the photos. Each house looked like something from a dream. Yards where Michael could play. Rooms with actual heating. Kitchens with full refrigerators. Things that normal people took for granted, but that seemed impossibly luxurious to him now. One photo caught his attention. It was a modest 2-story house with blue shutters and a big tree in the front yard. Not the fanciest option, but something about it felt right. Felt like a real home. "This one," Robert said quietly. "Can we see this one?" William smiled. "I had a feeling you'd like that one. I can arrange a viewing for tomorrow if you'd like. It's actually available immediately. The previous owners already moved out." "Tomorrow," Robert repeated, still trying to wrap his mind around how fast everything was moving. "There's something else we need to discuss," William continued. "What do you want to do with the money? Long term, I mean. This inheritance is enough that, if managed wisely, you'll never have to worry about finances again. But you're young. You might want to work, to have purpose beyond just having money." Robert hadn't thought that far ahead. He'd been so focused on just surviving that planning for the future felt foreign. "I don't know. I just know I never want Michael to go hungry again. I never want to feel that helpless again." "That's understandable. And you won't. But think about this. You've experienced something that most people with money can't imagine. You know what real poverty feels like. What real hunger feels like. That's valuable knowledge in a way." "I'm not sure I'd call it valuable," Robert said bitterly. "Perhaps not for you personally, but for others still going through what you went through, your experience could help them." Robert looked at William, not quite understanding. "I'm talking about using some of this money to help people," William explained. "Food banks, family assistance programs, job training. You could make a real difference for families struggling the way you were struggling." The idea took root in Robert's mind. All those nights lying awake, wondering if anyone in the world cared whether he and Michael survived. What if he could be that person who cared for someone else? "I'd like that," Robert said slowly. "I'd really like that. We don't need to figure out all the details now, but it's something to think about." William gathered his papers. "For now, let's focus on getting you and Michael settled. Get healthy. Get into that house. Start living again." The next morning, Robert signed the discharge papers with hands that still shook slightly. A nurse wheeled him out of the hospital in a wheelchair, even though he insisted he could walk. "Hospital policy," she explained. Michael walked beside him, holding tight to his father's hand. Outside, William was waiting next to a car. Not one of the black SUVs from before, but a regular sedan. Normal. That felt important to Robert. He didn't want to forget where he'd come from. They drove to see the house with the blue shutters. Michael pressed his face against the car window, watching the neighborhoods change from the rundown area where they'd been living to streets with nice houses and green lawns. "Dad, look at that playground." Michael pointed excitedly at a park they passed. "I see it, buddy. That's pretty cool." When they pulled up to the house, Robert's breath caught. It looked even better in person than in the photo. The yard was bigger than he'd imagined. The tree in front was perfect for climbing. He could picture Michael playing there, laughing, being a normal kid without worries. The real estate agent met them at the door, a friendly woman who showed them through each room. 2 bedrooms upstairs, a bathroom with a tub that actually looked clean, a kitchen with appliances that all worked. The living room had big windows that let in sunlight. Everything was empty, but Robert could imagine it filled with furniture, with life. Michael ran from room to room, his excitement building. "Dad, this room could be mine. And there's a backyard. Can we get a dog?" Robert laughed, actually laughed for the first time in months. "Let's take things one step at a time, okay?" The agent excused herself to make a phone call, leaving them alone to explore. Robert stood in the kitchen, running his hand along the counter. A month ago, he'd been heating soup on a hot plate in a freezing apartment. Now he was standing in a real kitchen in a real house that could be theirs. "What do you think?" William asked quietly. "I think I keep waiting to wake up," Robert admitted. "This doesn't feel real. It's real. And you deserve it. You and Michael both deserve this." Robert walked to the back door and looked out at the yard. It wasn't huge, but it was safe and enclosed. There was even a small patio where they could sit outside on warm evenings. Normal things. Simple things. Things he'd never thought he'd have again. "We'll take it," Robert said. The paperwork happened faster than Robert expected. William had already prepared most of the documents, and within an hour, the house was his. Actually his. The agent handed him a set of keys, and Robert just stared at them in his palm. "Congratulations on your new home," the agent said warmly. After she left, Robert and Michael walked through their empty house together. Their house. The words felt strange even in his mind. "It's so big," Michael said, his voice echoing in the empty living room. "When can we move in?" "We need furniture first. Beds, a couch, kitchen stuff. All the things that make a house a home. Can I help pick stuff out?" Robert smiled. "Of course you can. It's your home too." They sat together on the floor of the empty living room, their backs against the wall. Through the window, they could see the big tree swaying gently in the breeze. "Dad," Michael said quietly. "Yeah, buddy? Are we really going to be okay now? Like forever okay?" Robert pulled his son close. He thought about all the lies he'd told over the past months. Lies about having eaten when he hadn't. Lies about job interviews that didn't exist. Lies to make Michael feel safe when Robert himself was terrified. But this time he could tell the truth. "Yeah, Michael, we're really going to be okay. Forever okay." That afternoon, William took them to a furniture store. Robert had never been in a store where he could buy anything without checking the price tag first. It felt wrong somehow, indulgent, but William kept reminding him that he could afford it. They picked out beds, a couch, a kitchen table with chairs, dishes, everything they needed. Michael chose dinosaur sheets for his new bed and a lamp shaped like a rocket ship. Robert let him get both without hesitation. "When will everything be delivered?" Robert asked. "They can have most of it delivered tomorrow," the salesperson said. "The beds we have in stock, so those can go today if you need them." "Today would be great," Robert said. By evening, their new house had 2 beds, pillows, and blankets. It wasn't much, but it was enough. That night, Robert tucked Michael into his very own bed in his very own room for the first time. "This is the best bed ever," Michael said, snuggling into the new sheets. "Better than the old one?" "Way better. It doesn't make weird noises, and it's not cold." Robert kissed his son's forehead. "Sweet dreams, buddy. I'll be right across the hall if you need anything." "Dad?" "Yeah? I love you. I love you too, Michael. More than anything in the world." Robert went to his own room and sat on the edge of his own new bed. He looked around at the empty walls that would soon hold pictures and memories. This was their fresh start, their second chance. He thought about his Uncle Theodore, a man he barely remembered but who had saved them from across the grave. He wished he could thank him somehow. "Thank you," Robert whispered to the empty room. "Thank you for giving us our lives back." Outside, the sun set on their first day in their new home. Tomorrow would bring more changes, more adjustments to their new reality. But tonight, for the first time in months, Robert went to sleep without fear, without hunger, without wondering if they'd make it through another day. Tonight, they were safe. They were home, and that was enough. 3 months had passed since that terrible night when Robert collapsed on the bedroom floor. 3 months since William appeared at the hospital with news that changed everything. Sometimes Robert still woke up in the middle of the night, convinced it had all been a dream. until he felt the soft mattress beneath him and heard Michael sleeping peacefully in the next room. On this particular Saturday morning, Robert stood in the backyard of their home, watching Michael kick a soccer ball around with 3 kids from the neighborhood. The sound of children's laughter filled the air, and Robert couldn't help but smile. This was what childhood was supposed to look like. Michael had changed so much in these 3 months. His cheeks had filled out. He'd gained weight and grown taller. The dark circles under his eyes were gone. He laughed easily now, the way 6-year-olds should. Sometimes Robert caught himself just watching his son play, grateful beyond words that they'd made it through those dark times. But Robert had changed too. He'd gained back the weight he'd lost, and the hollow look had left his face. More than that, though, something inside him had shifted. He couldn't forget what they'd been through. Didn't want to forget, actually, because remembering meant he could help others who were still living that nightmare. Mr. Bennett? Robert turned to see Mrs. Chen walking across the yard carrying a covered dish. They'd stayed in touch after everything happened, and Robert had made sure to help her in ways she'd let him. She was proud and independent, but when he'd quietly paid off her mortgage, she'd cried and hugged him for a long time. "Mrs. Chen, you didn't have to bring anything," Robert said, though he knew she'd brought something delicious. "She always did." "Of course I did. You're having people over today, aren't you? The ones from the foundation?" Robert nodded. "Yeah, they're coming over this afternoon. We're finalizing some plans, the foundation. That had been Robert's idea about a month after they'd moved in. He'd talked with William about it, worked out the details, and created something he'd named the Second Chance Family Foundation. Its mission was simple: help families in crisis. Families like his had been. The foundation paid for food assistance, helped with rent when people fell behind, provided job training, and offered emergency funds for medical care. Everything Robert wished had existed when he was drowning. In just 2 months, they'd already helped 40 families in their county alone. "That's good work you're doing," Mrs. Chen said, patting his arm. "Your uncle would be proud." Robert thought about that often. Would Uncle Theodore be proud? He hoped so. The money had saved Robert and Michael, but using it to save others felt like the right way to honor his uncle's memory. Later that afternoon, after Mrs. Chen had left and Michael was inside watching a movie, William arrived with 2 other people from the foundation board. They sat around Robert's kitchen table, the same table where Robert and Michael ate breakfast every morning, and discussed expanding their programs. "We've had over 200 applications this month," one board member said. "Families needing help. The demand is overwhelming." "Then we expand," Robert said simply. "We have the resources. We use them." "Robert," William said gently, "I know you want to help everyone, but we need to be strategic. Make sure the foundation can sustain itself long term. I know. I'm not trying to throw money at every problem. But I also know what it's like to need help and have nowhere to turn. If we can prevent even one father from starving himself to feed his kid, isn't that worth it?" The room fell quiet. These people knew Robert's story. They'd heard it during the first foundation meeting, when Robert had explained why this mattered so much to him. He didn't share it for sympathy. He shared it so they'd understand that every application they reviewed represented a real family in real pain. "You're right," the board member said. "We'll figure out how to expand responsibly." They worked for another hour, planning new programs and discussing outreach strategies. When everyone finally left, Robert felt good about what they were building. Tired, but good. That evening, as the sun started setting, Robert called Michael outside to sit with him on the back patio. They'd made this a routine, spending time together before bed just talking about their days. "Dad," Michael said, swinging his legs from the patio chair. "Tommy at school said his dad lost his job. He seemed really worried about it." Robert's heart clenched. "That's tough for their family. I told him about when you lost your job, about how things got really hard for us." Robert looked at his son surprised. "They didn't talk about those times much." "What did you tell him?" "I said that even when things were really, really bad, you never gave up, and that things got better. I thought maybe it would make him feel less scared." Robert pulled Michael close. "That was kind of you, buddy. I'm sure it helped. Do you think about those times a lot?" Michael asked quietly. "Sometimes." "Do you?" Michael nodded. "Sometimes I remember being really hungry, and being cold, and being scared that you were sick. But then I remember that we made it through. We had each other. We did. We always will." I'm glad we help other families now, Michael said. Maybe they won't have to be as scared as we were. Robert felt tears prick his eyes. His 6-year-old son understood, truly understood what they were trying to do and why it mattered. You're a pretty amazing kid, you know that? Michael grinned. I learned from a pretty amazing dad. That night, after tucking Michael into bed, Robert sat at his desk in the small office he'd set up. On the wall, he'd hung a photo of Uncle Theodore that William had given him. It was old, faded, but it showed a man with kind eyes and a slight smile. Robert pulled out his journal, something he'd started keeping after leaving the hospital. Every night he wrote a few entries. Some days he wrote about the foundation, other days about Michael's progress in school. Sometimes he wrote about his memories of those desperate months, not to dwell on them but to remember why his current work mattered. Tonight, he wrote about gratitude. 3 months ago I thought we'd lost everything. I thought I'd failed as a father. I was ready to give up. But somehow we made it through. Not just survived, but actually made it through to the other side. Now we have this chance to help others find their way through too. I don't know if I believe in fate or destiny or any of that, but I believe in second chances. I believe in helping people when they need it most. And I believe that even in our darkest moments, hope can find us if we just hold on a little longer. He closed the journal and looked at the photo again. Thank you, Uncle Ted. Not just for the money, but for giving us the chance to do something meaningful with it. I hope wherever you are, you can see that your gift didn't just save 2 lives. It's saving dozens more. Robert walked through the quiet house, checking that doors were locked and lights were off. He paused at Michael's door, watching his son sleep peacefully. No fever. No hunger, no fear. Just a little boy dreaming whatever happy dreams little boys dream. In the kitchen, Robert opened the refrigerator. It was full. Always full now. Fresh fruit, vegetables, milk, juice, leftovers from dinner. Simple things that most people never thought twice about. But Robert thought about it every single time. Every time he opened that door and saw abundance instead of emptiness, he remembered. He made himself a sandwich, something he could do now without guilt or calculation. As he ate, he thought about the 40 families the foundation had helped. 40 families who wouldn't have to choose between rent and food. 40 families who could keep the heat on. 40 families who'd been given a chance. There was a knock at the door. Robert looked at the clock. 9:30. Kind of late for visitors. When he opened it, he found a young woman standing there holding a sleeping toddler. I'm sorry to bother you so late, she said, her voice shaking. Mrs. Chen told me where you live. She said you might be able to help. My husband died 2 months ago, and I lost my job last week, and I don't know what to do. We're about to lose our apartment, and I have nowhere else to turn. Robert saw himself in her desperate eyes, saw the same fear he'd felt, the same exhaustion, the same last thread hope that someone somewhere might care enough to help. Come inside, he said gently. Let's get your little one settled somewhere comfortable, and then we'll talk. Everything's going to be okay. As she stepped inside, relief washing over her face, Robert felt something settle in his chest. This was why he'd survived. This was why Uncle Theodore's gift had come when it did. Not just to save Robert and Michael, but to give them the chance to save others. The young woman sat on his couch, holding her child close, and Robert listened to her story. He'd make some calls tomorrow. The foundation would help with her rent, get her enrolled in their job training program, make sure she and her daughter had food. They'd get through this, just like Robert and Michael had gotten through it. Later, after the woman left with hope instead of despair, Robert went upstairs one more time. He looked in on Michael, then went to his own room. As he lay in bed, he thought about the journey they'd been on, the darkness they'd walked through, the miracle that had found them, the purpose they'd discovered. He thought about that terrible night when he'd collapsed, believing he'd failed his son. How wrong he'd been. He hadn't failed. He'd loved Michael with everything he had, and somehow, that love had been enough to carry them through until help arrived. The money had changed their circumstances, but love had saved them first. Robert closed his eyes, finally at peace. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new families to help, new ways to pay forward the gift they'd been given. But tonight he was simply grateful. Grateful for second chances. Grateful for hope. Grateful that when he'd starved so his son could eat, the universe had been preparing something beautiful for both of them. Sometimes the darkest nights really do come just before dawn. And sometimes when you hold on just a little bit longer, A whole fleet of miracles arrives to carry you home. D.